introduce our first panel. So ask all the speakers from the first panel to come up. We have Lori Williams, who is a professor at Mount Royal University. Jason Markusoff, who is a journalist with CBC and has been a journalist for many, many years here in Alberta. And Zain Velji, who is a partner at Northweather Strategies. So I will get everyone to come up. I'm going to not delve into bios. You can Google them. They're all very famous and fabulous people with lots of opinions that I'm sure you've seen on TV before. But we're just going to try and dig right in. And I believe we have a Mentimeter for this session. Somebody? Here we go. No Mentimeter. We'll get there. So this session, I would say, really consider it as framing for the next 2 days in terms of the conversations that we're going to have, but really also framing, I think, just the entire province and the political state that we're in right now. So, you know, this is a lot. One of the things that we talked about before we got here is a lot of people see two questions on separation happening in the country, and they tend to think of them as the same. And I think that one of the things that we deeply know here in Alberta, and we hope to kind of communicate, is that they're definitely not the same. That Alberta has a very unique culture, a unique history, and how we got here is really interesting. So you've got your Mentimeter up there. When you hear Western alienation today, what does it bring to mind? Very interesting responses. But yeah, let me get started with our excellent panel. So we're going to start with just a bit of framing. So maybe I'll start with you, Zain. Give us your kind of opening thoughts on this question and what we're facing here in Alberta today.
It's a shitstorm. Let's start here.
I did tell Zain to be spicy, so
welcome.
You're welcome.
Welcome to our shitstorm. Very well planned as a backdrop for this conversation to be here in Alberta. No, I just want to thank the conference for coming to Alberta and wanting to, as John said, have that dialogue and engagement. Not because this is the spiciest province right now, but because this is a conversation that has several impacts. I'll be very quick. This summer, we will all be judged, whether we live in this province or not, as being vertebrates or invertebrates, whether we stand up for our country or we do not. Anyone who is waiting for someone to save them, that is not going to happen. Anyone who is suggesting that separatism is not real is mistaken. Their leaders might look kooky. They might look like they're disorganized. We have seen several of the factors at play that we are suggesting right now, lessons that we should have embedded and learned that are happening right now in Alberta. Number one, our progress that we have as a society is not banked. We cannot rely on the institutions that have been there to save us ultimately. The progress we have made in our democratic both reforms as well as societally are not banked. Number two, we see very broadly that we are up against a minority, but a zealous minority, up against a very, very flabby majority. Welcome to all of us. We are asking ourselves questions every single day, but we're not doing jack shit about it. And we're not necessarily organizing, we're not moving, we're waiting to see how the question is framed, to see what happens next, to see what sort of move Danielle Smith has up her sleeve, so then we can finally get to discussing that, and then October will happen. And so we are in a situation where we are up against a minority, let's call it that, but an absolutely zealous minority up against us, a flabby majority. Finally, I think we are suggesting and seeing that most people that are joining the separatist movement are not separatists. They're separatist curious. And there's a playbook that is essentially being followed, which is you make being separatist curious possible, viable, acceptable. How many folks here are not from Alberta? Just hands up if you're from. Okay, excellent. 5 minutes from here, 4 months ago, like literally 5 minutes from here, the separatists held a 3,000-person rally in downtown Calgary. You think every single one of those people are separatists? Being a separatist is now socially acceptable. Number two, what do? You create an agenda of items that allow many access points into separatism. Any grievance you may have, including equalization, the fact that your kids don't call you, too many, discussions of trans rights in our school, whatever it might be, legitimate or not, is an entryway into being part of this broader coalition, including sending a message to Ottawa. Whatever that means, guess what? Who's not asking what that means? The separatist organizers. Whatever it means to you, dude, just come join. Like, whatever it means. You add all of that with a dance partner available in the United States, and if we think the United States is not going to play and tango with us directly or indirectly if this question is called, we are sorely mistaken. And then you add on the flabby majority aspect of it. That's how an issue that was once polling at 20%, now polling at 30%, ends up ultimately potentially winning. Now, I will add one more final piece and I'll hand it over. This could also be a summer of absolute euphoria. And I don't mean the television show. I mean, which, by the way, season 3, terrible. Everyone's too famous now. Okay, anyways, a summer of euphoria in the sense that this is actually a 70-30, 80-20 question. If we get our act together, use dialogue as a structure, but start organizing, we could end up in a very jubilant, pro-Canada, euphoric outcome in October. But it does not happen if we view this thing scared and if we don't respect our opponent in terms of what they have been and what they are going to do over the course of the next several months. I'll stop there.
Just before Jason, I just want to give some context to folks in the room outside of Alberta. So just so you are aware, there is no current question on on the separation on the referendum ballot. Stay tuned. We do expect that tomorrow. We hear the Premier spot some TV time. So that will likely happen tomorrow. And then the other piece, just for context as well, is this is an entire referendum composed currently of 9 other questions. And so a lot of the pieces that we're talking about here today involve some confusion for a general voter or for a general Albertan who might be going to the polls and saying, sorry, which question am I voting on? Yeah, Jason.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and convening such an excellent lineup and somehow making me part of it. So I could talk about the long history of Western alienation, but I think like our bios, it's probably Googleable. There's the Firewall Committee in 2000. There's long climate change pipelines. There's a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Tyler Dawson, wrote a just sort of book about separatism for Sutherland House, and he talked about the separatist comments and secessionist sentiments that began in 1905 when this province was founded. But there's another thread, another timeline, kind of storyline that created this movement and helped foster this movement, and that was much more recent. That was the pandemic. When you look at all the bios and the backgrounds of a lot of the separatist leaders, it's almost like the Avengers story of them all their origin stories started with COVID, largely. This one had her yoga studio closed, and she got back into law and started fighting that way. This one in northeast Alberta had his sporting goods store closed down. This one was a doctor who was very frustrated with things. This one had his restaurant closed down and became a cause célèbre, or some of the church leaders who had their places closed down. And they all coalesced and got very active on COVID. And then as that died down, their distrust of institutions and of Canada and government led to this moment. And what's interesting about that is that it produces an organization and a separatist activist core that is not necessarily wanting this pipeline. I mean, for some people that will dampen the enthusiasm. For the 30%, some who are now say they support separatism, or maybe 27%, not sure how many of them are going to be disillusioned or be suddenly wafted off, because they've been motivated by other things. They've been motivated by this, very near apocalyptic perception of what Canada is, of what our leaders are doing. And what's challenging and interesting about this distrust and this movement kind of rooted in COVID, is that there's such deep distrust of so many institutions that the justice system that has shut down the first two questions the first two times, that's corrupt. They're going after us. Elections Alberta prosecuting this massive data breach by the Centurion Project group. That's lawfare. That's going after us. Institutions are massed against us. So the battle lines being drawn and the dichotomies are not just about it's about fact. There's a whole different fact universe being played out in certain circles, and it's interesting as a journalist to try to deal with that.
Wonderful. Lori.
So I'm going to go back to where this sort of started. Jason and Zain have both spoken about this a little bit, but I want to also sort of point to a shift that's happened recently. So I think Western alienation or separatism, particularly in Alberta, centers on a sense of, I would say, disenfranchisement, not having enough of a voice in the country politically, economic disadvantage, things like different freight rates depending on what goods are going where in the country. These trace back a long, long time. And that's been around for a long time, that sense of unfairness. And I think it's really important when we look at leaders who maybe seem a bit as Jason Kenney described them, over-caffeinated. It's important to distinguish between some of the leaders and what you might disagree with in terms of what they say. And there's just widespread view in Alberta that there's unfairness and not enough of a voice in Confederation. So it's been around, and if you've got the slides there, there's this cartoon from 1915 that we're all familiar with, where you know, the work and the feeding of this nation is being done in Western Canada, and the corrupt bankers in Central Canada are reaping the rewards for that. So all of this has been shifted. It's not the same anymore. This isn't the populism of old. And the next slide just lists a number of the factors, the institutions that are distrusted and so forth. The corrupt elites, suspicion. And this suspicion is turning on Alberta leaders as well. You see some of the separatist leaders saying that they're going to go after Danielle Smith if she doesn't do their bidding. So it's fairly widespread. But the things that have changed are three main factors. First is social media, and that's a relatively recent phenomenon. Oxford's word of the year last year was rage bait. This universe feeds on emotion, and particularly on anger, on grievance. It magnifies it. Influencers and platforms are making money off of this. The thing that you want to drive attention, the most successful factor is of course, anger and rage. The second thing is the coarsening of political rhetoric, and it's happening, of course, online, but it's also happening with some political leaders. I don't need to tell you which direction from Canada you need to look for an example of that. Name-calling, mis- and disinformation, threats. Many in this room have experienced that. People on this stage have experienced that. It's making us less willing to talk with one another. And I think there's a problem there, but probably because, at least in part, of the dehumanization that goes on. And then the third thing, of course, is COVID-19, this attack almost on freedom, the constant changing of you know, what this virus was and what it required and what the vaccines represented and so forth. And these were all quite problematic. So we've got a bunch of folks who love freedom, and it might be a more robust version of that in some parts of Alberta, where wearing seat belts is seen as too much government control. But what we're also seeing, I think, is a real sense that freedom is under threat. And so what we see in populism, and the next slide, we'll talk about some of the problems that have emerged out of this. So if you've got issues with government, and with democracy, you want democratic representation, you want your voice to be heard. You've got a couple of main options here. One is the direct democratic mechanisms, referendum, recall, and so forth. So between elections, you've got a voice. That's the appeal of that. But the other thing we have between elections is oversight, independent individuals and bodies that give opinions, advice, and correction to government. And so I was doing a chapter in a book recently, and when I was writing my conclusion, I was struck by the list that I'm about to share with you. That independent oversight, the independent voices, are under significant strain, if not attack, in Alberta, and not just from government, but from others as well. It includes the Ethics Commissioner, who was removed for finding a conflict of interest on the part of the Premier. 2 chief electoral officers that have come under significant attack, and I know there are elections Alberta folks here that are experiencing a fairly significant wave of communication from people that are angry with some of the things that have happened recently. The Auditor General, in the midst of an investigation in a controversy over healthcare spending, has not had his contract renewed. We've seen 5 AHS CEOs under this particular government, 3 chief medical officers of health, 2 AHS boards. And if we can go to the next slide, there's been reduced accountability. The laws, regulations, and structure of government have made it more difficult to get access to information, for example. Changing the rules if the results are not accepted. The reporting requirements for gifts and so forth, because there was criticism, those rules were changed to limit the reporting. Shifting oversight for freedom of information and privacy or access to information requests, shifting that from the Ethics Commissioner to the Premier's Chief of Staff, limiting the capacity of oversight bodies to review their members, whether it be their medical expertise, their legal expertise, or ethics and so forth. So the Medical Association, the Law Society, we saw the Justice Minister making well, one of the laws said that justice ministers would be immune from oversight by the Law Society, and the Justice Minister shortening the Election Alberta investigation time from 3 years to 1 at the very time that someone he was connected to was under investigation. Basically cut short that investigation. We've seen attacks on judges, on journalists. Many of the people in this room have come under attack for these sorts of things. And then, of course, the use of Section 33 in a preemptive way. And all of these, if you were to do what we're seeing in polls, that Albertans' primary concerns are things like affordability and healthcare and education. And yet these are the things that are detracting attention. So it's a bit of a deflection and distraction that's going on with respect to this. And if we want to reinvigorate democracy, we need to understand what's going on. We need to know that this is a partial list and that there are additional things that we need to pay attention to, and that we, by reaching out and connecting with others, can make a difference. I don't think there's a Captain Canada here. I think it's you and me. And I think our discussions on an everyday basis, our connections with people, asking them why they are dissatisfied, what they're upset about, and what we think we can do about it together, that's going to be the key. And I'm quite encouraged by all of the sessions that have been set up today that are talking about how to engage in that kind of dialogue.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for setting the stage. I think what you've spoken about does give a bit of context as to how different this is from Quebec and some of the grievances that I think Quebec has versus where the historical roots are in Alberta. Some of you may have been in the room last week for a conversation with Corey Hogan and Jason Kenney. And one of the things I really appreciated, Jen Gerson, who was the moderator in that conversation, is she said that we don't need to both sides every debate. And, I think for those of us on the stage and for a lot of us in the room, I think that's really, really true. And I think that's how we feel about this conversation, that we don't need to be both sidesing it. Just because we've got 3 folks up here, 4 of us kind of talking about this issue, we didn't also need to include a separatist. And I think one of the things we've seen with this idea of both sidesing the debate is the weaponization of the number of people who've signed the referendum. So we've seen Danielle Smith use that 700,000 number as a way to say, well, we need to have this question because it otherwise disenfranchises 700,000 people. But, I think from reality, we can say probably it only disenfranchises maybe 100,000, maybe 200,000. The people who actually want the question on the ballot are separatists. Those who want to stay in Canada, those who signed the Forever Canada petition, are not the kinds of folks who want to see the question on the ballot. So when we talk about the disenfranchisement and potentially not putting a question on the ballot or putting one on, how do you see that play out structurally in the long term in Alberta politics? So, does it change how parties might form? Does it change other things in the province in terms of how we engage federally? What does that look like, if people do feel disenfranchised here? And maybe I'll start with you, Zain.
It's so hard to predict long term because every prediction is wrong in Alberta, and then you're being recorded, and then that's played back to you, and then you're like, oh my God, who's that idiot? I can tell you what it means for Danielle Smith. She needs a release valve of some sort. She'll probably try to deliver one this week, whether that means, railroading the courts or not. She will try to get a version of a separatist question on the agenda by October. Whether the Clarity Act steps in its way or whether the Prime Minister says you cannot ask those questions alongside your other immigration questions, TBD. But the Premier needs a release valve because she has gone to the right in winning her leadership with that party, and even then that was not right enough, because this group has wanted to fundamentally take over and or have always been part of the UCP and the governing majority. Splintering, is that possible? Yes. Keeping them housed under one container, that's the challenge right now. And so fundamentally what we are seeing is a woman who is putting her own political agenda, survivability, and or issues in front of not just the issues for Albertans, and Laurie's summary, by the way, excellent, around all the activity that's happened, including the distraction and deflection from broader issues. That's just the start of it. It's not that we're not just talking about healthcare, or that underneath the surface of when we talk about separatism, things on healthcare and education have been happening that would be headline-grabbing stories and advocacy moments in their own right. It's that it is distracting the entire country, taking all of us to reaffirm our place in Confederation, which I am not going to personally let her take advantage of, which is why we need all of us to have this pro-Canada moment that quashes this, that moves this along, that ensures that we have the upper advantage. On a 70-30, 80-20 wedge issue, it should happen and it needs to happen.
Jason, before I'm going to throw in one more question in there. A lot of folks who feel disenfranchised also criticize the media environment. Obviously, I think you've taken a brunt of that. So how do those things play together, and how do you potentially, is there a pathway to ever rebuilding trust with these folks, or do we have a severing of the population?
I mean, on one level, I think there's some, it's interesting. I will go to some of these events, and sometimes they'll be very happy to see us because they're happy to, somebody who's amplifying their vote or just going to listen. Like I went to, I've gone to some of the smallest towns in Alberta, just with an open mind, and that helps. It's often, it's like oh, I don't like CBC. Oh, but you're okay, Jason. And that's just not for me. That's, I think, just it's easier to demonize the big blob of an organization than the individual, and especially when somebody's coming out to see you or to talk to you. So that's actually one of the things that CBC as an organization has been trying to do outreach, almost community boards, just going out to places and meeting people, because we know that trust has to be earned. We know that there are a lot of forces and probably some mistakes along the way that have led to that. But in terms of the disenfranchisement and this vote in this moment, there's been a lot of the parallel, people comparing this to Brexit in the motivation in the way that Danielle Smith is doing this, much like former Prime Minister David Cameron talking, who had to quell the internal Brexiteers within his movement, and he held this referendum. Danielle Smith may be in that vote. She will swear up and down that she is not separatist. Detractors will say otherwise. I can't look into her heart, but she has, I don't know if she's proposing this pipeline, if she's up there with federal government and Gary Bettman announcing the 2028 World Cup of Hockey in Calgary and Edmonton, if she thinks that this is going to be a whole different country by then. In fact, there's an interesting dynamic and mentality among a lot of people in her inner circle who want this, who say, let's have this referendum, let's give them this vote, let them have their butts handed to them, and let them sulk and go home and go away. And that strikes me, and I know a lot of other people, as a very bloody-minded and dangerous way to approach it. Because there's always been separatism sentiment in Alberta. It's measured well before this in the low 20s. It hasn't gotten much higher, but the difference now is that there's an energy. There's a place for them to channel it. There's a place for there's been this. They spent the last several months gathering these signatures for this petition, and then should there be this referendum, and should the courts or the feds not wind up blocking it, they will spend the next 5 months from now channeling their efforts into this. Does that movement go away? Does that movement try to overtake the United Conservative Party and create the vehicle like the Parti Québécois or the UK Reform Party? We don't know, but the gamble in both that they lose and lose badly, and that it goes away is, well, that's an experiment.
I think there's no doubt that that no matter what happens, like even the ballot question doesn't matter because we've structurally changed Alberta. We've had a huge shift in our politics. So, Zain, I know you wanted to jump in there.
I'll jump in very quickly on the media question. While they distrust the mainstream media, they have building this insane army of online content creators. This will be our first real test of algorithmic online content creation that might be paid for, funded by foreign actors, in addition to being legitimately funded. But they have volume. And they're playing the algorithmic game very, very aggressively. The second point I want to make is around attention, which is one of the reasons we are covering this as a national story. It's not just because of the pathways that the three of us have laid out in terms of why this could happen and result in the outcome, but fundamentally it's a 20 to 30% issue. But these folks are masters at manipulating attention. And in our new political reality, attention is divorced from what you are wanting to do. And Jeffrey Rath and Mitch Sylvester and all these folks are incredible at harvesting attention. You might call them kooky, you might call them weird, you might call them, how can these people have any followers? Well, guess what? They're better than almost everyone in this room at harnessing attention, including some of our political parties. And the reason they have our attention is because they know how to operate in this algorithmic environment to get attention, which is why we're covering an issue that's an 80-20 slam dunk the other way, because A, most of us are lazy, but B, these guys know how to get attention, and that is what is building their coalition daily, despite the fact that, yeah, observably, we're probably smarter, we're probably more educated, we're probably more put together. That is exactly what they want you to think.
Lori, I'm going to jump to you and I'm going to ask you a question as well. You talked kind of in your build-up about those grievances or sentiments that have led to this feeling of deepening the Western alienation and those things. You know, we've now seen an MOU come forward on a pipeline. We've seen a surprising amount of cooperation between Mark Carney and Danielle Smith. We've seen Mark Carney, I think, polling between 35 and 40% in Alberta historic. Do any of those realities change, or how do those realities interject with this conversation? And can Danielle Smith really maintain, both sides of this coin?
I'm reminded of, you've probably seen that video of Jean-Claude Van Damme with a foot on each car and the cars are moving apart. That's Danielle Smith in what's coming here. I think she's going to be really pressured to take a stand one way or the other. I want to pick up on a few of the things that have been said here. There are leaders who are focusing this sense of grievance, the disenfranchisement, the real sentiment that is shared by a lot of Albertans at perhaps a much lower level. Folks who think, well, I'll vote for leaving and that'll just send a message to Ottawa and they'll have to negotiate a better deal with us and so forth. It's really important to understand that they're going to focus on the differences, but we have a lot more in common. And I know Jared Wesley is going to be in the next session talking about his research that shows how much we have in common, how we can actually connect with folks by listening to them, by engaging with them, trying to understand where they're coming from, and also talk about the good things about Canada, about this province, about what we can do together to address some of the issues that we're dealing with. There's a real sort of a caricaturing of people And it's important to understand that the leaders may seem comical or out of touch or whatever, but they're tapping into something that people really feel. And if we dismiss them, we insult the folks that have the legitimate or feel they have legitimate concerns. Yeah. There's a dehumanization that goes on. Jason talked about, oh, you're an okay journalist. I talked to a journalist who had people throwing things at him when he was on camera, covering the Coutts border blockade. Then he went up to these folks and they were going, mainstream media, you're terrible. He says, I'm here. What do you want me to say? And suddenly they saw him as a human being and they could start to have a conversation. We have things that cross-cut these divisions. We have things we can work on together. We have the possibility of speaking with one another, understanding one another, organizing with one another to try to improve some of the communication, some of the concerns that we have. And it's not going to be about the leaders, or at least not exclusively about leaders. It's going to be about us and what we explore and what we try to do. It's a difficult game that we're in the midst of at this point. But I think we do ourselves and others a disservice if we dismiss them as stupid or evil or dangerous, which is often what happens, or some combination of all of them. The reality is that quite often they're bright and they have legitimate concerns, and rather than try and convince and fact check them, we need to try to speak with them and understand them.
All right, thank you so much. I am going to ask for questions from the audience. We've only got a couple of minutes. I think there's somebody with a microphone. Maybe just raise your hand if you have a question. There's a question in the front here.
Great. Thank you. That's on. Good. Great. Thanks very much. All of you are speaking about the need to talk to one another, and your examples are analog examples of talking to one another, going to a small town and just being human. Your example, Laurie, of Jason Kenney. And then you talk about the cesspool that is the online universe in this moment. How do you counter the online with digital tools, not just analog ones?
Zain, maybe do you want to take a crack at that?
We can't see the algorithmic online territory despite its toxification to the other side, period. I believe that the algorithms are going to be the death of us in some ways, but I'm not willing to sacrifice their effectiveness to the other side in this period. That might be a controversial take, which means that we as the collective pro-Canada side need to produce content at scale, convincing people about not just not leaving Alberta, but what the arguments for Canada are. One of the most interesting aspects of this debate is that the separatists have a laundry list, a lot of it is fucking bullshit, around why Alberta should separate. However, the pro-Canada side is stuck in Canada, of course. Is that an argument? Is that a defense? Is that a case? Is that a narrative? Is that a story for this country? And I feel that one of the things we will stop doing or potentially struggle with if we don't get started immediately is making the narrative case for this country, reminding each one of us the warm blanket feeling that we have around this country, the benefits, the examples, the stories, the shared history. We need content to be created online, offline, and in person that allows that to happen. So the short answer is we cannot see the territory. The longer answer is what I think we have to take advantage of is the same thing they've taken advantage of. They've got a massive head start with multiple creators creating online content that's pro-separatist, having foreign influences. I'm not advocating for the latter part on the other side of the ledger, but what I am advocating for is we need narrative storytelling about this country, about this province, about that shared history, because it's not existing right now. And if we think that people are going to be convinced to stay just because we say Canada and don't have any backup reason or narrative or story, we're sorely, sorely mistaken.
I also think there's a bit of exhaustion in talking about, facts and figures, and people are tuning out. There's too many facts and figures. There's too much Donald Trump on TV. I do think that the storytelling and making it fun and interesting is a big part of the piece that we have to sell. Maybe I'll grab another question and then we'll, any other questions?
Hi.
Perfect.
Do you mind touching on the Boundaries Commission that was rejected by the government and the ripple effect it can happen in the rest of the country?
On the ripple effect thing, hard to say. It'll really depend. I think people will be watching how it's received. It's so norm busting. It's not. We'll see how it unfolds. I think that there's an awareness from the United Conservatives themselves that they don't. They know that gerrymandering is a bad word. In fact, when the NDP were wielding it in the legislature, they try to get it struck down as unparliamentary language. So they're sensitive to it. They obviously want, there's obviously an impulse to maximize their own advantage. Will they do something that I don't think they're going to be doing what's exactly done in the States. It'll be several shades. Well, it'll be Canadianized, I suppose. Will other political actors try to do the same thing? It'll really depend on how well it's received, I'd imagine. We've seen a lot of other norm-busting politicians. Al Smith isn't the only one to more liberally use the notwithstanding clause these days, or other moves to say hold her will over municipalities. So it's interesting to see what the democracy lab that is provinces how they will influence each other.
I think a lot will depend on how we respond. And I think there are a couple of, if you haven't seen them, stories in the Globe and Mail and on the CBC that are sort of tracking the seat distribution under the different maps. Important to look at that, important to contact other people, talk to other people about this, but of course contact your MLA. We've seen a couple of times where they just got inundated with communication. That could, if they hear enough of a backlash, if they think there might be a political price to be paid for it, that might be enough to temper the results. I think we have to take seriously in a democracy that our voice can make a difference between elections, and one of the ways we can do that is by making our voices heard as individuals and as collectives.
Sorry, we have to wrap up. I just want to thank Zain, Jason, and Lori for this wonderful conversation. You can catch all of them on TV at some point or another, or expressing more of these opinions as this unfolds. And I'm sure we're all going to be here for a little while at least. You can come up and ask more questions as you see us in the hallways. But thank you so